How does a killer commit a string of highly publicized, brutal murders in the heart of the British Empire, only to vanish forever? In 1888, London was a city defined by extremes. An industrial machine created enormous fortunes for the upper classes, while millions of others were forced into grim, grueling conditions to survive. Looking closely at the streets of the Whitechapel district, you see the reality of this divide. The area was overcrowded, plagued by disease, and barely lit by scattered gas lamps. These tightly packed, impoverished alleys created a dense physical and social maze. It was an environment suited for a predator to stalk targets and slip away unseen. This hand-drawn map highlights Whitechapel's chaotic, intersecting lines. On August 31, 1888, this maze became a crime scene. The body of 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols was found here in Bucks Row. Police initially assumed it was a common street altercation. Then investigators examined the body. Her throat was severed, and she had suffered horrific, deliberate mutilations. London's police force was trained to handle organized theft and drunken brawls. They were entirely unequipped to process a killer who mutilated their victims in the street. The brutality found at Bucks Row was the first step in a calculated campaign of terror. Just 8 days later, a second victim, Annie Chapman, was discovered. The violence inflicted on her body was even more severe. Investigators noticed a calculated precision to the injuries. The killer was not striking in a blind rage. He was executing a methodical, deliberate process. The local reaction was immediate. Newspapers printed sensationalized accounts of the injuries. Residents bolted their doors, and women avoided walking the streets after dark. Authorities flooded the area with extra patrols, yet the killer evaded them entirely. His ability to strike and vanish in heavily policed areas placed the entire city under a state of siege. Any remaining illusion of safety collapsed on the night of September 30th, a date that became known as the Double Event. The night began with the discovery of Elizabeth Stride in a dark, narrow yard. Unlike the previous victims, her body lacked extensive mutilation. Investigators concluded the killer heard someone approaching and fled before finishing his ritual. Deprived of his time with Stride, the killer sought out another target. Less than an hour later, he found Catherine Eddowes. The killer inflicted an extreme level of trauma on Eddowes' body, shocking veteran officers who had spent decades walking London's toughest beats. Navigating a neighborhood swarming with police on high alert and successfully killing 2 women within an hour proved the murderer was operating with total impunity. Then a new dynamic emerged. Newspapers and police stations began receiving mocking letters claiming responsibility for the attacks. One specific letter concluded with a signature that cemented the killer into history: Jack the Ripper. Historians still debate whether this letter was written by the actual murderer or an opportunistic journalist. Regardless of their origin, the letters gave the killer a name that the public would never forget. On November 9th, the violence reached its peak with Mary Jane Kelly. Because she was killed inside her own room, the murderer had unrestricted time. The resulting crime scene was the most extreme of the entire series. And then, immediately following his most horrific act, the killings simply stopped. The killer's abrupt disappearance at the peak of the violence ensured his identity would remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Victorian police conducted thousands of interviews and followed up on countless tips. The massive manhunt yielded 0 tangible results. Looking at these butchers from Eastman Vermided, you can see why one prominent theory suggested the killer was a local slaughterman. A worker covered in blood would barely warrant a second glance in Whitechapel. Other investigators pointed to the surgical knives and bone saws used by doctors. They argued the precision of the specific organ removals required formal anatomical knowledge. Detectives searched for a clear motive, like robbery or a personal grudge, but found nothing, leaving them with a perpetrator who killed for reasons they could not yet define. The failure of the Whitechapel case forced authorities to rethink their approach, laying the earliest groundwork for modern criminal profiling. The world now had a name for this specific pattern of violence: the serial killer. Today, the physical evidence has decayed and the witnesses are gone, leaving the killer's true identity out of reach. He remains an unsolved mystery, a faceless shadow, forever walking through the fog.